If cinema is just something that you put your heart into and has character depth, then it's going to mean something different to everybody. Good morning / afternoon / evening, and welcome to the show. It's time to sit down and put in those earbuds so as not to disturb the neighbors, because this is Off Book, a podcast about Broadway, movies, TV shows, and so many other nerdy things. I'm your host, Marc Stouffer III, and today's episode is all about some of the differences between blockbuster movies and more independent films. Back in 2019, renowned filmmaker Martin Scorsese made headlines when he said, in regards to superhero movies, that, quote, "I don't see them. I try, but that's not cinema. Honestly, the closest I can think of them, as well made as they are, with actors doing the best they can under the circumstances, is theme parks. It isn't the cinema of human beings trying to convey emotional, psychological experiences to another human being." End quote. So, that got a lot of people upset. But it also got some people thinking. Those huge blockbuster movies are fundamentally different than one of Scorsese's films. The question then becomes, is that okay? And so I'm arriving fashionably late, as always, to weigh in on this and give some of my thoughts. And to be clear, it's entirely my opinion, and if you disagree, that's a lie. As I was thinking about this, I think that regardless of which side of this argument you agree with, whether you think that superhero movies and blockbuster movies are cinema or they aren't, I think that both sides really make some pretty good points as far as the people that know film are going. There are a lot of fanboys of Scorsese's films, there are a lot of fanboys of Marvel movies that are just trying to say, "Oh no, they're really good. They're really good. Stop being mean to them." But as far as people that actually know what they're talking about, that are weighing in on this, I think that they all have some pretty good points. The main point on the side of Marvel movies being considered cinema is that movies shouldn't be judged on how emotional they make Martin Scorsese, but rather they should be judged based on the quality and how well they stick to the genre that they're trying to do. They say that every movie is trying to do something different, and so a movie should be judged on how well it's doing whatever it's trying to do, and it doesn't matter if Martin Scorsese thinks it's cinema or not. If people enjoy it, and it does make people emotional, then it should be considered cinema. And I think that that's really the biggest issue here, is that what is cinema? If we're going by Martin Scorsese's definition of it makes people emotional and it can kind of connect with people, then a lot of people would say that Marvel movies do that. I highly doubt that Martin Scorsese saw Avengers Endgame, because he said that he tried some superhero movies and didn't like them, and you generally don't watch Endgame without watching other movies in the MCU first. But a lot of people got emotional over Endgame. A lot of people may not have gotten emotional at one of Scorsese's films. And as I said in my episode about film franchises like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the MCU is able to do things in their movies that Scorsese couldn't do, because they have so many films and they're all tied together, and each film has its kind of own sub-genre. And so you go on this experience and you get to know these characters and you have this experience. So that way, when you get to the end of the arc in Endgame, you've come to kind of live with these characters for the last 10 years. And I think that's a good point to make, is that it's important to recognize whether you agree or disagree with the assertion that superhero movies aren't cinema. I think it's important to remember that every film is going to do something different. Because I think that if every film was going to try to elicit the same emotions and tell the same kinds of stories with the same kinds of characters in the same ways, it would be very boring. And obviously, no one wants that. I'm not saying that that's his point. I am saying, though, that there are some people that kind of hear that and go,
"Oh, well, every kind of cinema is different."
And yes, it is. And I think it's important to remember that. And even Martin Scorsese said in a different interview that, with the advent of streaming services, which we have an episode about, if you want to go check that out after listening to this one, the entire landscape is changing, because movies are made to be watched in a theater. But with streaming services, a lot of movies are being watched at home instead of in the theater. Or in the theater and then at home, like before when you went and saw it in the theater and then bought the DVD. Some people will never see a film in a theater, but only see it on a streaming service because it didn't go to the theater. The Oscars are having a similar thing, where typically 2020 is a little bit different because of the pandemic, but generally a film has to have some sort of theatrical release to be considered for an Academy Award. Because in their mind, in their definition, that is what cinema is. So cinema is anything that plays in a theater. And so you find this argument that I think is true, that films need to be able to figure out what they're going to do and manage to accomplish that thing. Whether that's an established genre, whether that's using time-honored techniques and doing things that seem familiar, or it's something that's completely different. You need to know what you're going to be able to do, and both Scorsese's films and Marvel movies do that. Therefore, they're all films. But on the other hand, I have the argument of people that agree with Scorsese that say that the important part of his statement wasn't the theme park part, it was the human depth. That in order for a film to be cinema, in order for it to be art, in order for it to be something that is created by an individual that really cares about what they're doing, it needs to have that character depth. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of Marvel movies don't have those. Obviously, the characters do have that depth, as we saw in Endgame, but most of the movies don't have that. Most of the movies aren't as emotionally complex as Endgame was. Endgame was only as complicated as it was because of all the other films in the MCU. Like I said, I don't know if Scorsese saw Endgame. I would be interested to see what he would have thought of it and if that character depth was enough for him. But also, like I mentioned, Endgame relies very heavily on the other films in the cinematic universe. So had they just released Endgame in 2008 before Iron Man, it wouldn't have made any sense. You wouldn't be able to get that kind of emotion. The emotion exists not necessarily exclusively, but in a large part because of all of the sold-out movies that didn't have that depth. And so the argument that they're making is, you need to be able to make a film that doesn't rely on any other film. This isn't part of a trilogy. This isn't something that is crafted, at least in part, by a studio. This isn't a sequel. This isn't just telling more of a story. This is creating an original story, and it may be in a series, but it doesn't rely on the other series. It's just as good of a film in its own right. I'd be interested to see what Scorsese thinks, and he may have given his opinion on this somewhere, on the Star Wars movies, specifically the original trilogy, because that is a very similar idea to Marvel, where there's obviously a plan in place ahead of time because the story continues. Each film kind of works on its own, but it also does rely very heavily on the films that came before it. And so I'd be interested to see what his thoughts on that are, because the original quote did say superhero movies, but I don't know if that's referring to all blockbusters or just superhero movies. He also mentioned in an interview that his problem was that these blockbusters are taking up theater space. So he's started making movies that are going directly to Netflix, or have a limited theatrical run and then go to a streaming service, because he can't get a long run in a theater because these blockbuster movies, these quote-unquote theme park movies, are taking up the space. And so the argument against Marvel movies being cinema is that in order for it to be cinema, it can't be part of this huge blockbuster. It has to be something that's really felt, that is crafted for the love of the art, that is a new original idea, that pushes boundaries, that tries things, and that Marvel movies don't do that. In a way, it's more crafting an original idea and then running a whole bunch of numbers to figure out how that all work, to tie it into something else, to pay off a setup from an earlier movie, to create fan service, and Endgame was full of fan service. And so they make some pretty valid points too, that if a film is created more by numbers or by a studio than by a filmmaker who wants to make something, I can definitely see why someone would think that doesn't count as cinema. Because you need to really feel the passion to make that movie, and the characters need to be characters that feel things not for the sake of fan service, not for the sake of completing an arc, but feel things because they're well-written characters that can feel things. So it's a very complicated setup, and I think, honestly, I don't really have an opinion. I think that whether or not they're cinema, superhero movies are movies, and they are an art in and of themselves, and whether Scorsese likes to use the word cinema with them or not doesn't really affect me. I'm going to go see more of his movies. Of course, I'm going to respect Scorsese's films, and I'm going to enjoy them. He is an amazing filmmaker. I'm not even going to disagree with him, because, he's probably right in at least some regards. But I think it's really not my place to say if they're cinema or not, because he was just expressing his opinion, and he's allowed to have whatever opinion he wants. And I think that he is right in some things. And if you take out the perceived negative attitude towards them, it is something that seems to make a little bit of sense, saying that, it's a different kind of filmmaking, where it's not done for the art, it's done kind of like a theme park. It's trying to optimize guest enjoyability. But on the other hand, if you have an idea for a movie that you really want to make, but that no one's going to watch, are you still going to make it? Trying to optimize the viewer enjoyability is something that needs to happen when you're doing script edits and when you're revising things in a film. It can't just be about your artistic vision, unless, I guess, you're Martin Scorsese. So is Martin Scorsese the best person to weigh in on this? There's a lot of specific things, but I think generically speaking, a film it's film. It's you create a project with some actors, you film with a camera. meaning that an 8-year-old from Idaho can make a film that is just as much a film as the most expensive Hollywood production ever made. And I think the question of if something is cinema or not really is kind of on a case-by-case basis. If cinema is just something that you put your heart into and has character depth, then it's going to mean something different to everybody. Today's episode is sponsored by Cry on Cue for You. The argument that a lot of people make to call superhero movies not cinema is that the characters can't connect with the audience on a genuine level. But what's more human than crying? Nothing. Nothing is more human than crying. And Cry on Cue for You has a huge team of actors that are experts at crying. They're very bad at acting, but they're very good at crying. So hire one of these actors to be in your next film and do a terrible job until the one scene where their character cries. Because one scene is all it takes to connect with an audience and cement your film's place in a subjective view of cinema. Now, more on subjective opinions. I think the reason that Scorsese's comments sparked such internet and Twitter outrage is because he was saying something that's such an opinion, and he's saying it as fact. You know, if you look at what he said that's not cinema. The closest I can think of them is a theme park. Which, to me and a lot of other people, that didn't really sound like, hey, I don't think this has the kind of artistic integrity that you would need to call something cinema. He said that's not cinema. And I'm not here to miss words. I'm not here to try to decide what he meant by that. But I think that that's what caused a whole other debate really within this debate, where there are some people that are arguing independent versus blockbuster films, and there are some people that are arguing, can we even make an argument like that at all about anything with something as subjective as films? Films are made by filmmakers, and filmmakers have their own creative visions, and they have their own ideas on how to make a film, and each film is going to accomplish something else, and they're going to do that in a different way. Even two films that are trying to accomplish the same thing emotionally, or tonally, or with pacing, or visually, are going to do it in a different way. No two films are going to be the same, and so if every single film that ever gets made is different from every other film that ever gets made, even within something like the MCU, you have these kind of subgenres where you have an overall MCU style, but Guardians of the Galaxy is going to be different than Thor: The Dark World. And so and even Thor: The Dark World is different than Thor: Ragnarok. You have these very different styles and different goals. And so when each film is so much different than every other film, how do you judge what's kind of the art form of film, cinema in this case, and what's not? Some people say that it should be up to each individual person, and that we shouldn't bother saying whether something is cinema or isn't cinema, just saying that you enjoyed it or you didn't. And again, I'm not going to try to determine what Scorsese was saying, whether he was saying that it was or wasn't, or if it was just his personal experience. But there are definitely some people that say Marvel movies are not good, they are not art, and they mean it. And there are some people that say they are art, they are the highest form, they are better than anything Scorsese will ever make, and they're also being as definitive. Whereas some people say, hey, how about instead you say, I cried at this movie, I thought it was very good, I liked it more than The Irishman, or whatever. Something which isn't as definitive, because every person's going to experience every film a little bit differently. But on the other hand, that does make it very hard to figure out if a film is quote-unquote good, because how are you going to know if you're going to agree with this opinion? You just go with majority rules, and whatever opinion is most popular, you try to find specs of other people similar to you. It's very hard to determine whether you're going to like a movie based on very subjective views from other people. So some people say that you shouldn't even take into account how emotional it makes you when you're watching, and you should just look at the craft, how good the film will look on paper. So how good is the writing? How developed are the characters? On a scale of 1 to 10, how effective does the emotion appear to be? How is the scene constructed? And what parts of it are designed to make the audience emotional? And how effectively does it seem to do that from what you observe, but has nothing to do with your personal experience because it's so subjective. And so you can look at that and go, okay, it's very well made. There's a high likelihood that this will make me emotional, and now I know. But then, of course, that's only on paper. And there are a lot of films throughout cinema history that looked like they were going to be good on paper, but weren't. And so then, if you're only judging by what happens on paper, then how do you know how well it actually did what it was trying to do? Something could be very well made and still fail miserably. Like what Scorsese said about Marvel movies, that he thought that they were very well made, but failed to land on the emotional component they were trying to deliver. Now, of course, the question then is, why does it matter? Why does it matter what's cinema and what's not? But people make art, a lot of people have their opinions, and I think that I agree with them too. I think that a lot of people put so much emotion and energy into trying to figure out the definition of a word that is ultimately subjective, when they could be spending that time to watch more or even to create something.
Instead of arguing about what is or isn't cinema, just go make something. Go spend your time productively. Stop fighting on Twitter.
But that said, I do think that it is an interesting conversation because it does have some real world implications. Like I mentioned, the Academy Awards currently defines cinema as any movie that has I think it's a 7-day run in a California area theater. So if I paid enough money, I could probably make a short film and get it eligible for an Academy Award. I wouldn't win, obviously, but I could. Not to mention that Martin Scorsese could make a film and distribute it directly through Netflix, and Martin Scorsese could make a film that isn't eligible for an Academy Award. So does that mean that the Academy is wrong? Does that mean that their definition of cinema is wrong? I think that it is quickly becoming outdated. That definition worked very well before streaming services, or in the early days of streaming services, but now that there are so many films going directly to digital release, in 2020 with the global pandemic, the Academy opened it up to direct-to-digital releases, and so direct-to-streaming service movies can be nominated. But next year, barring an extension of the pandemic, which I really hope does not happen, that will no longer be the case, presumably. But a lot of studios have said that their plan is to continue releasing some films directly to a streaming service and bypassing the theater immediately, which may open up some theaters for some more independent films, making people like Martin Scorsese happy. But it also means that there are going to be a lot of blockbuster films that aren't eligible for an Academy Award. The question then is that okay? Do they deserve to be eligible for an Academy Award? Should we try to quantify what makes a film versus not a film? Martin Scorsese himself, has embraced the streaming services. So will the Academy. This episode isn't about the Oscars, but I do think that the ability to win an Oscar has a lot of pull over what somebody does with a film. Should you only be eligible to win an Oscar if you go to a theater? So it's an important question that we'll have to see how the Academy answers. The other reason that this is so important, at least to people like me, is that the filmmaking community is just that. It's a community. And most of the time, it is a community that comes together and supports each other and really wants nothing more than for everybody else in it to succeed. Yes, there is some competition to see who can beat some records or do well or get the most mentions from the media, but ultimately, filmmakers like to support each other and like to see other filmmakers succeed. But then you find these things like this, where you find these intense battle lines that are being drawn between things like blockbuster movies and movies that are made more as an art instead of as a way to make money, which is what a lot of people view blockbusters as. And so you find this community kind of taking sides in a battle that I don't think needs to exist. I think that Scorsese's comments, like I've mentioned multiple times, are very valid, and it's an opinion that he's allowed to have, and he makes a lot of good points, and I agree with some of those points. I disagree with some of those points as well, but that's allowed, and you're allowed to disagree with me. And I think everyone's allowed to have their own opinions. But I do think it's important that we think about what he said, because he does have a point, Should there be a way to determine who gets to be in the theater and who doesn't? Should you be eligible for an award if you go to a streaming service? Should the Academy put more narrow definitions on what kinds of films are eligible? Are you going to say that sequels don't, or that parts of a franchise don't? Or are we going to leave it up to the consumers, and people can make what they feel is film, and it's literally film, and audiences can determine how rich of an experience it was, and if they were emotional based on how they see it? I personally think that last one is the best option. So filmmakers, need to take a look at what they think is art and make what they think is art, and know that somebody, no matter how good of a film you make, is not going to like it. And somebody is going to think it's not cinema and that it wasn't a rich enough experience. And somebody's always going to think it's amazing. And somebody's always going to think that it is better than this other film. And everyone's always going to think that this film should win an award, or this film should win an award, or this film shouldn't be allowed to win an award. And the streaming services are this, or streaming services are that, or the theaters need this. Or someone is always going to agree with you or disagree with you no matter what you say. Specifically in the filmmaking world. So filmmakers need to kind of listen to the opinions of people they disagree with, so that way they can be more informed and can make films that ideally entertain more people, because that's the ultimate goal of film, is to express yourself as an artist, but also to reach people emotionally and to give them an experience that means something to them. And then they go make what they want to make. And the audience of the people gets to decide how well it does and how much they think it's cinema. And with that, this episode is over, and it's up to you to take to Twitter to determine if it's really a podcast. Next week's all about different Broadway composers and the trademarks that make their musical styles uniquely their own. I hope you have a great rest of your week. I'll see you next time.